So I'm going to rush through I'm not going to develop the history. I think people are familiar with South Africa. Just to say that it's a little bit different case in the sense that because of settler colonialism, land was privatized at an early time. And this was based on mass dispossession, accaparement, taking over the labor and so forth of indigenous African. So I am posing this question in relationship to the ANC state, which was presenting itself as a pro-people democratic state, and what have been the results after 20-some years of land reform. This is a chart of the population versus landholding, white and black, in 1994. So we're looking at a situation in which both the land system and organized agriculture are rooted in this colonial tradition. And in many ways, not only is this a historical problem, which is the whole rub with the government's discourse, but it's also been in many ways reinforced since 1994 because it is anchored in the same landholding system and capitalism, in the socioeconomic system. So this determines, as people have been saying, not only the organization of production, but the access to usable land and water, as well as resources in general. And just globally, very quickly, we're talking about two countrysides is one way that it's referred to, which is the former reserve areas, or Bantustans as they're called, and then these white commercial farming areas. And they're called white because the farms are owned by the white minority, but the majority of the population is black. Even though through the course of history in the past several years, there have been major evictions, massive displacements off the farms, so you have increasingly large informal rural settlements. So to come quickly to the agriculture sector, it is one that is highly concentrated and centralized, and all the way up the value chain. We're talking about a handful of conglomerates, reorganized central cooperatives or agribusinesses, alongside with these 37,000 farmers that continue to produce. These changes of streamlining the economy began back in the 80s to become more efficient, but they were pursued in 1994 with greater liberalization, more investment, and particularly the integration of the economy further into market export and the competition of the market in general. So this is partly based on the idea that social development, which has been such a central part of the ANC's promises, would be financed by growth in the classic neoliberal sense. So the idea was this is about the centralization of the sector. If we have time to come back in discussion, we'll look about how concentrated production chain is. Rising food costs. So what is the situation today? There were 60,000 farms in 1996, and now they're down to about 35,000. But the important point to retain in this is that a fewer number of white farmers actually continue to control almost the same percentage of land as 22 years ago. So there's a lot of debate about what the exact percentage is and so forth. But this is a concentration in a very clear case. Land reform has transferred some 8% of the land, but then there has been also a phenomenon of reconcentration of land because, as in many countries, Chile, Ecuador, and many others, there has been the phenomena of people being obliged to sell their land, the poor in particular. Since then, that has been stopped by a new nationalization policy where most land reform land has been is now in the hands of the government. So it's interesting, this case of Argentina and taking over land for national parks. Imagine that in a private context where formerly crop and cattle farms are now also merged and in a form of increasing wildlife production for especially private hunting and the large international ecotourism business. And it's mainly a luxury tourism type of thing, which is one thing I've worked on in particular. So you have the scale question of the scale of the farms being merged together and the control of land being held in the same hands without, in fact, producing food except for game meat. And then you have the scale of the inequalities and the displacement that occur as a result of that. So it's not that land reform was not questioned or that ownership was not, in fact, there was a huge debate before 1994. But the problem is that the Constitution, in fact, enshrined the protection of private property, and that continues to be, a debate today. So this market-assisted land reform in the form of willing buyer, willing seller, has generally excluded the poor, has had a very poor distribution rate, and has essentially led towards deracialization, as the government likes to call it, of a certain part of the commercial farming sector. And these farmers face all the obstacles that you might imagine that capitalist agriculture presents to them, and reflection of the exclusion that they have experienced over the past period. I wanted to go into the question of farm workers and labor tenants, which is a special interest of mine, because that is the other side of the picture. What is the social impact? I guess we can discuss it tomorrow when there's another presentation. But the resulting rights for this category of people has been extremely modest, or in fact non-existent for certain categories. And that is a whole political discussion, because some of the legal trappings are there, but they have not been able to be implemented. This has resulted in a major strike 2 years ago, people probably read about in the press. So I am trying to be a little provocative here in making the relationship and the example of this ANC democratic government and the results of following a neoliberal model. What are the conclusions of that? I think it's an important thing to debate over these days, because there is a question of what kind of political rule protects private property, protects the land system as it is, and the difficulty of, in fact, changing that. It's not that we shouldn't struggle for rights or that we should not try to take as much from the system as possible. On the contrary. But it's a question of putting this question out. Is land reform within this kind of a political framework able to lead to what people need? Will it deeply question how agriculture is organized, for whose benefit, and for what social transformation, I think as someone raised this morning? Because I think it's important to look at, I mean, it's the thrust of the work of several of us, that the path that this government has taken is not actually a deviation from what should be. It's exactly the way that it's supposed to work. It's supposed to not serve the poor. It's supposed to push down the poor further, which we call a polarization in sociological jargon. In other words, that's what's happening. You have a growing middle class in South Africa, you have a rich class that's becoming richer, and you have a rural population that is essentially left aside with some social grants to sort of taper the edges of all that. So this is all in the context of globalization and the dynamics that make this worse, you know. And I just think that it's important to look at a different concept of what the rural population not only can do, but must do if there is to be thoroughgoing social transformation. Thank you.